Masha.
Hi, Rabbi.
What do you got for me today, Masha?
Well, Rabbi, of course you've heard the Ariana Grande song, God is a Woman, right?
Oh, I listen to it every day.
Of course, why wouldn't you? And so I've been thinking, there's this whole tradition of considering God as a man. Where did that come from?
Ah, it's a really good question. I think there's two places I know about. One of them is simply grammar. In the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew is a gendered language, and so to refer to anything, not just people, but even objects, you got to choose a gender, and there's no neuter, so you got to choose one. And so in the Bible, they did choose the masculine singular for God, except one of the weird things is that some of the words they use for the name of God are actually plural words. And yet they take the singular verb tenses. So it's a little bit like our modern phenomenon of using they as a singular for trans folks. That's actually what they do in the Torah for God.
Hmm.
But but that doesn't really answer the question, I think, of why would they choose male pronouns in the first place, or why would they
Yeah.
choose male verbs in the first place? And the way I look at it is that it's about metaphor,
Hmm.
that this whole idea of God, of there being some power in the universe or some supreme being, or however you're going to think about it, which frankly, the Bible is not so clear on how they think about it. Um, it's about how do you find metaphors that get at what you want.
Hmm.
And I think for people in the ancient world, when they thought of metaphors that were about power, they thought of male words, right? They thought of words like king and lord,
Hmm.
uh, those words that are really in their times, in their situations, that was who had the power.
Hmm.
So males have the power. God must be among those who have the power, or better, a metaphor for God. Better metaphor for God would be those who have the power. There are other instances, like even in the Torah, there are other names for God that actually are feminine. Words like the word spirit, which is sometimes used for God,
Hmm.
is actually in Hebrew can be either masculine or feminine, which is kind of
Ah.
interesting. There's not very many words like that.
Hmm.
And there's a couple of words like the word Shaddai, which is a word applied to God, which its root is in the root for breast. So it's a very much a nurturing word, and idea of God as the feminine is built into that. And then later on, the word Shekhinah, which means um, sort of God's presence, is in fact a feminine word.
Hmm.
Uh, so there is some counterbalance there. I think it's a combination maybe of people initially feeling like those power words were male words, and then succeeding generations, which were big surprise, also patriarchal societies.
Big surprise.
Big surprise that they were choosing those ones, right? They could have emphasized the feminine ones, but they didn't. They
Hmm.
chose the male ones. And it's not also not another no big surprise that most of those people doing the choosing were men. And so now seeing God reflected in themselves was something they had a vested interest in.
Hmm. So does it make sense for God to have a gender at all?
I mean, I personally don't think so. It's actually, I remember there was a panel when I was in rabbinical school of students to talk about the question of what words we use in prayer, and basically my position was for God we shouldn't be using gendered pronouns at all, or maybe we should alternate since there's no choice in Hebrew. We should alternate to make it clear that God is neither a man nor a woman.
Hmm.
But when we're referring in the prayers to people, well, people do have gender. And so it might make sense. Again, you want to be inclusive in your talk about gendered of people, but in terms of God, one of the books that I used to read to my kids when they were really little was talked about what is God, and one of the really strong things it said is God is not a man and God is not a woman. And I remember that my kids, like going to bed at night when they were 3, they would look up at me and say, "Daddy, God is not a man." It's like, that's right. And God's not a woman. I was like, okay, good, got it. Yeah, but there's no reason to assume that gender, the categories of gender would apply to God, or that that's a useful thing to do, except I think maybe to counteract the centuries of referring to God only with power words that applied to men.
Hmm.
Then maybe there is something about talking about the feminine side of God, or applying these words which are about qualities traditionally associated with women, like nurturing,
Mhm.
and saying like that if there is a power in the universe that is greater than all others, then I guess it must include those things as well, and maybe those things more than some of those other things, which maybe a lot of the things about ruling over might really be human projections on God rather than getting at something about God's essential nature.
Hmm. So let me get this clear. Ariana Grande is not wrong. She's just not fully right.
Yes, we'll have to have Ariana on the show and really talk to her about it.
Okay, Rabbi. Well, on the topic of quarantine, our question this week for the ancients is what would they think about people violating state and city guidelines about quarantine?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they were pretty into state and city guidelines themselves. um, so yeah, in general, the ancients, especially the ancient rabbis who lived under the Romans,
Mm,
they were pretty clear that you should follow what the authorities tell you to do.
mm,
And you, of course, mainly because they knew that they lived in a marginal kind of position in their society, and that they had no standing to try to tell the Romans what should and shouldn't be done.
mm,
So they were big on following what the state tells you to do. I think beyond that, they really were clear that health and life were the most important things. And so pretty much anything that would preserve your health, or especially preserve your life, even if it's something that normally would be prohibited up
mhm,
to limits, um, you should do it. And people who violate that and put not only their life at risk, but other people's lives at risk, which is what people violently quarantine orders are doing, that's a really big no-no as far as the ancients are concerned. Like, you might say that you have authority over your own life, but you certainly don't have authority over other people's lives. So
mm.
you really should be following all that stuff. And of course, there were plagues in ancient times, and they lived through these things. So they knew, and they knew a lot more about medicine than we usually give them credit for 2,000 years ago. So yeah, I think they would have some really choice words to say about people who violated quarantine orders. And they also did not hold back. We sometimes have this idea that in ancient times people weren't like us, and they didn't go off the handle once in a while, but the ancient rabbis, even in writing, sometimes went way off on folks who did things they didn't approve of. So I can only imagine the wonderful stream of Aramaic invective they would unleash on such people.
Well, I guess that brings you to another question about, if they thought that they should abide by the Roman law, even if they found the Roman law unethical, what does that say today about people violating quarantine in order to attend Black Lives Matter protests or
Mm.
engage in civil disobedience, which does violate the laws and might put people's health at risk, but they think, answers to a higher ethical standard?
Right. They really struggled with the idea of protest,
Mm,
and violating the law in order to save it, violating the law in order to save their own idea of what law was. So, on the one hand, they have this statement called Dina de Malchuta Dina, which means the law of the government is the law, i.e., you should follow it. On the
mhm,
other hand, they spent a lot of time calling out, either implicitly or rarely explicitly, Roman law, and saying it was unjust, unethical. It's just that as a minority group in a oppressed situation, they were reluctant to take it on directly. So
mhm,
we are in a much different position now, especially living in the United States, in a country where theoretically at least our rights are protected and our right to protest is protected. Then I think they'd feel a little less compunction about participating in protests that even does violate the law, because they, within the area they controlled, within Jewish law, they were very clear that often the law needs to be violated in order to save other parts of the law. And it's one of the tricky things about Jewish law, that people often have the idea that Jewish law is sort of strict, like you have to follow everything that happens. And there's almost no part of Jewish law where there aren't exceptions,
mhm,
because other values come into play,
mhm,
as we might expect, right? So even something like we were talking about before about the laws of keeping kosher, but in situations of food scarcity, in situations of medical need, they were really clear that the law actually requires you to violate the laws of keeping kosher in order to follow the general principle of preserving life. So all these things are always being weighed against each other. And sometimes it's a tough call. Sometimes it's an easier call. But I think for them, probably the Black Lives Matter protests would be a pretty easy call in terms of the fortunate situation that people are in our current moment.
Mm-hmm. But it's time for my favorite section, Test the Rabbi. So I'm going to read to you 3 verses from part of the Pentateuch, which I will not tell you where, and you have to guess where it came from. You ready?
As ready as I'll ever be.
Okay. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his host hath he cast into the sea. His chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They sank into the bottom as a stone.
Yes, well, this, luckily for me, is an easy one.
Oh no!
Because it comes from a really distinctive part of the Torah in Exodus, where the Israelites, having just left Egypt, cross the sea and they're on the other side and they sing a song. And so it's the poetic language that tips you off more than anything else about where this is in the Torah. And one of the great things about these lines is that, according to Bible scholars, these are actually just in the form and the grammar of the Hebrew. These are more ancient than the whole story that surrounds them.
Wow.
And so that they theorize or guess that maybe, not talking about like where the origin of the story is, but just in terms of the words, that these words may have been the core of the story, and then the narrative was built around the poetry. And so all the poetic parts of the Torah tend to be the old ones. And I guess that makes sense if you're thinking about remembering exact wording. It's easier if it's poetry. So this is very old Hebrew. And its interpretation is also rough because it's older and some people understand less about it. But the idea of God being a man of war at that moment when God has, killed the firstborn of the Egyptians, defeated the Egyptian army, they've drowned in the sea. It's, the Egyptian army was the greatest army on earth. And the idea that the slave people would somehow cross over and then their God would somehow kill the whole Egyptian army. Well, there's a reason they're calling God a man of war. That's that metaphor we were talking about earlier, this idea of a powerful metaphor, like, yes, God's going to fight for us. God's going to be like a man. That's what's celebrated here. The other interesting thing I'll just say is that the whole song begins with Moses and the people of Israel sang this song at the sea. And then at the end of the song, there's this line that says, and then Miriam and the women took their timbrels in their hands and they sang a song to God at the sea as well. And what is their song? It starts with exactly the same line as the one attributed to Moses. So some people think that maybe originally the song was actually Miriam's song. And then the editors somehow attributed it to Moses and put it in Moses's mouth. It was in the mouth of the man.
Attributing women's words to men, a unique concept.
And people also point out that Miriam and the women, it says, took timbrels, like tambourines, in their hands. And why did they have tambourines? They were leaving Egypt. And they're like, well, let's make sure to take the tambourines. And so the ancients say that, this is the merit of Miriam and the women, because the men were taking, food or garments or whatever they were taking. The women said, there's going to be a deliverance here. God is going to save us at some point. And when that happens, we want to be ready to celebrate. So let's make sure to take the tambourines.
Well, Rabbi, I don't mean to be a stickler, but your son Mati actually guessed which book it was in. So can you tell me which chapter of Exodus it is in?
All right, now this is going to be tricky. So wait. It's Exodus. I think it's chapter 14.
15.
Oh,
One off.
so close. So close. Oh, Masha, when you play Stump the Rabbi, you always win.
That is true. The rabbi can't win them all.
Or maybe any of them.
Likely any of them. Masha is a vindictive player in this game.
Well, I have to give it up to you, Masha. There's only so much power that a rabbi has.
And infinite power that a Masha has.
Well, Masha, it's been so much fun to talk to you as always. And I want to give a shout out to our fans out there, both of them. We're so glad that you both are watching, and want to know if anybody wants to put a question in our mouths for us to talk about, you can always contact us at mashaandtherabbi.com.
Well, Rabbi, our inspiration, Masha I Medved, Masha and the Bear, which is a Russian children's TV show, has 4 billion views on YouTube. So we've got a lot of work.
Oh my God, 4 billion views. This tells you what people are interested in. Is it Masha talking to a rabbi, or is it Masha interacting with a bear?
Definitely the former.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
We'll prove that. We'll prove that over time.
With time. Well, this has been a great episode, and I look forward to talking with you next week.
All right. Bye, Masha.
Bye, Rabbi.